1 year ago, as Hurricane Harvey inundated the greater Houston area with as much as 51 inches of rain. Jeff Lindner, 35-year-old meteorologist from the Harris County Flood Control District, rose to fame as he calmly updated millions of scared Houstonians. Televised news conferences and Twitter posts with important facts about the rising water levels across the region. Jeff's reassuring manner and straight, no-nonsense answers in the midst of the most challenging natural disaster our city has ever faced has earned him national recognition and an unexpected following of devoted fans. Please welcome Jeff Lindner.
All right. It is hard to believe that 1 year ago tonight is when the rains would start and the waters would start rising. So the worst part of Harvey would come to us tonight. Today's the 26th. And that would be tonight into tomorrow, Sunday, the 27th of last year, would probably be one of the most difficult moments of my entire life, as it was probably for a lot of us out there. And a lot of us, our lives are now defined by what happened in those 24 hours. It's before and after. Just like generations before us, it's been before and after Carla, or before and after Alicia, and this is before and after Harvey. So this presentation I'm going to go through is the kind of the scientific part of it, like what happened, how much it rained, how big Harvey was, the impacts of Harvey, and then we'll have some time at the end for some Q&A. All right. So I'd like to start with the hydrology of Harris County, because we have two things here. We have flooding comes from two things: the weather, the meteorology, and also the hydrology. And the hydrology is something that we've been given. We can't really change it. Harris County is broken into 22 different watersheds. Important to know that most of our water in this county drains from west to east. So it ends up in Galveston Bay. None of our water goes directly to the Gulf of Mexico. It's also important to know that we do not have any big river systems coming directly into Harris County. We do have the San Jacinto, but for example, the Brazos River to our west and the Trinity River to our east, none of that water directly affects us here in Harris County. So for example, on the Brazos, when it rains up around College Station or Waco, that water does not affect us here. It does affect Fort Bend and Brazoria counties, but not Harris County. And we're somewhat fortunate in the fact that we do not have a big river system like the Mississippi or the Ohio, where it can rain 1,000 miles away and in 2 weeks you can have a flood. All of our flooding pretty much comes from the rain that falls directly on top of us here. We do not get a lot of water from other places. There are 2 flood control reservoirs in Harris County, and hopefully after Harvey everybody knows. There is Addicts and Barker, and they're in the western part of the county. They were built in the 1940s by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to protect downtown Houston and the Houston Ship Channel from flooding. And for 70 years, they did exactly that. They were built after the the plan for this was built after the 1935 flood, December of 1935 of all months. We think of flooding, we think of summertime, warm time. One of our biggest floods here actually happened in December. We had 20 inches of rain in this area of Harris County right here, and that resulted in tremendous flooding down in downtown Houston in 1935. So these were built in the 1940s to protect downtown Houston, and for 70 years, they excelled at that job, protecting Buffalo Bayou, the city of downtown Houston, the Ship Channel, from flooding. And the one thing I'll say about Harvey is Harvey was simply the storm that exceeded those designs. As in so many other locations across the county and across the region, what we build to was just simply exceeded by the sheer volume of water that was dropped on us. So this is a track of Harvey initially forming as a tropical storm in the eastern Caribbean and then degenerating into a wave, crossing the Yucatan, redeveloping in the Gulf of Mexico, and went from a tropical depression to a Category 4 hurricane in about 42 hours. So rapid intensification. A lot of that took place right here as the storm was nearing the coast. It made landfall near Rockport and Port Aransas, Rapid intensification is not new. How many of you are here for Hurricane Alicia back in 1983? A lot of you. That went from a depression to a Category 3 hurricane in 60 hours. So these storms can develop very quickly. They can develop right on the coast. We're not always going to have that 5 days like we had with Ike and Rita for those storms that come out of the Atlantic and we can watch them. A lot of our storms that happen here happen very quickly. They form and hit very quickly. Allison, back in 2001, formed 60 miles off the coast of Galveston and hit 8 hours later. You would have went to work that morning with nothing out there, and you would have come home to a tropical storm making landfall. So things can happen very quickly here. That's why we encourage everybody to make sure they have a plan, so you know what you're going to do. Have those supplies in place in case something like that happens. This is the forecast. This is Saturday morning, August the 26th. The forecasts for Harvey, especially the rainfall forecast, are really good. As you can see, they might have been a little low, but I think we all understood we were going to get a lot of rain. And we all knew there was going to be some degree of flooding. I think some of us thought, well, maybe this is going to be like Tax Day, or maybe this will be like Memorial Day 15, or maybe this will be like Tropical Storm Allison. Because in our minds, that's our historical context. That's the only thing we could compare this to. But I don't think any of us, including myself, could truly understand what 3 and 4 feet of rain really looked like. And I think we all struggled with that. Because there just wasn't that historic context. It's like if I came out right now and said, next week we're going to have 145 mile per hour winds. Most of us have never experienced 145 mile per hour winds. What does that look like? What does that do? And so I think we all had an idea we were going to get a lot of rain, we were going to have flooding, but the widespread nature of it, the entire county, the entire region, is what I think we struggled with trying to understand going up to it. The other thing that was really important was the messaging of we were not going to have a hurricane in Houston. The hurricane, those damaging hurricane force winds, everything you think about when you hear the word hurricane, power outages, windows blown out, roofs blown off, trees blown down, that was not going to be what we were going to deal with here in Houston. That was down at Rockport and Port Aransas. And so there was a very fine line of messaging Hurricane Harvey, but Hurricane Harvey for us, right here locally, was going to be the flooding that would come later. This is landfall. This is Friday night, the 25th of August at 10 o'clock. Harvey crossed the coast. The strongest hurricane to make landfall in the state of Texas since Hurricane Carla back in 1961. Carla made landfall about right there at Port O'Connor, so Harvey was roughly in the same area as Carla. This is the deadliest hurricane to strike the state of Texas since 1919. 68 direct fatalities resulting from Harvey, all of them from water. Inland freshwater flooding. No one died from the wind, and no one died from the storm surge. We all think of wind. When we hear hurricane, we think of wind. It is the water that is the deadliest aspect, if it's storm surge or rainfall. So for the most part, we were fine here through landfall Friday night, Saturday morning, even during the day Saturday. We had some tornado activity on Saturday morning in Fort Bend County, and then Saturday afternoon up in Northwest Harris County. And this would be 9 o'clock Saturday evening. And this is when things went bad, and they went bad very, very, very fast. So this is the center of Harvey, located just northwest of Victoria. So the storm made landfall about right there. So it had moved inland about 50 miles or so before it stopped. This was still a 65 mile per hour tropical storm, even though it had been inland now for 24 hours. So it was very slowly weakening. It's very flat down here in this part of Texas, a lot of fields, a lot of agriculture, so there's not a lot of friction to break up that circulation. And plus, it did not move very far from its moisture and heat source, the Gulf of Mexico. Kind of hung out down there in that coastal Bend area for a couple days. So here we are up here, a good 140 miles or so from the center of this, and all of our problems would develop from this single feeder band, very thin, only about 4 or 5 miles wide, but moving very, very slowly from west to east across Harris County, starting about 9 o'clock Saturday evening. Everything you see here in this red is rainfall rates of 4 to 7 inches per hour. Per hour. Most of our street drainage systems, like you see out here, the underground systems, can handle about 2 inches of rain an hour. So we were greatly exceeding the ability of those street systems to drain the water. So this underground culverts filled up very quickly. The streets filled up. The streets are purposely designed here to flood. They're cut down to hold water in these extreme type of an event, to hopefully keep it out of the homes. The problem is if it keeps raining at that rate, the water simply has nowhere to go. And it starts flowing across the ground, and it starts getting into homes. And if it keeps raining at that for 2 or 3 hours, you start getting up around 8, 9, 10 inches of rain. That's when you start to have the problems from the creeks and the bayous. Sunday morning, early in the morning, we started to get a very large influx of 911 calls into the 911 centers of people saying, I'm going to drown in my house. And that is very rare for us in Southeast Texas, especially in Houston. Because we're so flat here, the water tends to spread out horizontally. So it doesn't tend to get very deep vertically in the homes. So a lot of our flooding is usually knee-deep or less in structures. Occasionally you might get waist-deep water. But this was a situation with Harvey, especially down around the city of South Houston, Pasadena, the Hobby Airport area, where water was getting to life-threatening levels in homes. So we're talking neck-deep, chin-deep water. One thing we learned in 2005 from Hurricane Katrina is that when people went into their attic, they did not have a way to get out of that attic. And if the water keeps rising, you're trapped. And it could potentially be a fatal decision to go into the attic. So as difficult of a decision as this was, we worked with the first responders and the Emergency Operations Center to craft a message to tell people you need to get on your roof. If your life is in danger in your house, do not go into your attic. Because if the water keeps rising, there is no way that you're going to survive that. And we fully knew what we were telling people to do. You're asking someone to get on their roof when it is pouring rain outside. But that's the situation we were facing on Sunday morning. And here you can see this is about 5 o'clock in the morning. That band that was on the western part of the county the evening before had just made it to Galveston Bay. All night long it took it to move across the county. And unlike Memorial Day 15 and unlike Tax Day 16, all of this additional rain developed behind that initial band. So you got a small break after that band moved through, and then it started again. Memorial Day 15 and Tax Day 16, once that main band moved through, the rain ended. There was also the realization on Sunday morning around sunrise that there were no longer any government assets to deploy. If it was available, it was deployed. Every fire truck, every boat, every high water vehicle, every air asset had been deployed in this region. We had nothing left to send out. There was additional resources staged in College Station and the Huntsville area, but also for the first time, every single one of our 22 freeways was underwater. We could not utilize our freeway system. We've never faced that ever before. We've always had at least 1 or 2 freeways available to us. If you go back to Ike or other storms, we could get resources in through that. Surface road travel was almost impossible on Sunday morning. It was very difficult to move around. So at this point, you're looking at boat operations, marine operations, or air operations to come in and do that rescue effort. 53,000 911 calls in 11 hours. At any one time, there was 6,000 to 8,000 calls on 911 in queue that could not be answered. So the decision was made, and Judge Emmett, working with the fire rescue operations and the EOC, made the decision to go out and ask for civilian help. It's the first time this has ever been done, certainly the first time in our area. If you look back at it, I don't think anybody needed to be asked, because this is what we do here. When we see people that need help, we're going to go help them. This helped coordinate this effort. We needed people to call in, and we divided the county up into these quadrants as field command posts developed and government resources were being launched from these locations. Civilian resources would also arrive, and at least we were coordinating this effort, so we weren't sending government resources to a house or a location that people had already been picked up from. And that was a little bit of a struggle on Sunday morning of trying to figure out where people are doing what. It became even a greater amount of struggle when outside help started to come into this region. So you started to get residents from other states coming in, and they weren't aware necessarily of how we were operating this effort. And so this continued on like this for the next 2.5 days of that rescue operation. All told, about 100,000 people were rescued by government resources, and we estimate somewhere between 30 and 50,000 people were rescued by civilian resources, although we'll probably never know what those numbers actually are. These are some of the rainfalls with Harvey. So we had a 1-hour rate of about 7 inches, a 2-hour rate of about 12 inches, a foot of rain in 2 hours. There's no drainage system. I don't care anywhere. There's no drainage system that can handle a foot of rain in a 2-hour period. About 20 inches in 12 hours, almost 2 feet of rain in 12 hours. And then the 2-day totals and the 4-day totals just keep adding up. We added about a foot of water every day on top of that first evening that we had. These are some of the totals that happened over in deep southeast Texas and Jefferson County. The maximum total we have from Harvey, 60.58 inches, is the greatest amount of rain ever to fall from a tropical cyclone anywhere in the United States, including the state of Hawaii. And no, Lane did not beat this record this week. It came close, but it did not beat it, at least not yet. We had several locations here along the Gulf Freeway of over 50 inches of rain. This is down in Galveston County, the Friendswood area, over 50 inches of rain. And if you look at this, the previous greatest tropical cyclone rainfall in American history before Harvey was 48 inches. Each one of these locations exceed that, and there's about 30 other locations that exceeded 48 inches. So how does that compare with some of the other storms we faced? I think all of us who went through Tropical Storm Allison could not imagine anything worse than Allison when Allison happened. Allison was our benchmark historic storm here. And we couldn't imagine something worse than that. And then, of course, Harvey happened. So here's the comparison with Allison and Harvey. Allison still has more intense rainfall here in the 6, 12, and 24-hour period. But where Harvey exceeds everything is that it just kept raining. And you can see that here in these 2- and 4-day totals. I put tax day up here because everyone's familiar with tax day. Tax day just really has no comparison. I will point out, though, that if you look at some of the other storms, Memorial Day 15, Tax Day 16, pretty much all of the rain happens in a 6 to 12-hour period. You can see here, everything fell in 12 hours, and then it was done. It stopped raining. Memorial Day 15, kind of in this area here, a little bit to the southwest, 11 inches of rain in 3 hours, and it was done. It wasn't that continuation over the next several days. October 1994, anybody remember October 1994? This was a very big flood, especially up in the north and eastern parts of the county. This is when the San Jacinto River had record flooding. We had pipelines erode and rupture on the river, and the river actually caught fire back in 94. And I put it up here. The totals fall short, but the overall coverage, how much rain fell over how big of an area, was actually similar to 1994. That's that footprint. Everything you see in black is 30 inches. So from the Sabine all the way down to about the Colorado, a little bit southwest of the Colorado River. Everything you see here in yellow is 15 to 20 inches. So you're talking about a huge area that had enormous amounts of rain. And unlike Tropical Storm Allison, or unlike Tropical Storm Claudette back in 1979, or any of the other storms we faced, it wasn't just Harris County. Every single county around us was going through the same thing we were going through. And it was really from the Louisiana state line all the way down to the Victoria. And we had just had a Category 4 hurricane impact at Rockport and Port Aransas. So how do you quantify this? How do you try to wrap your head around it? And this is one way. These are the greatest rainfall events in American history, dating back to 1851. So this is for 2,000 square miles over a 5-day period. So how much it rains over 2,000 square miles in 5 days. The previous worst event was in the state of Louisiana in 1940, and it rained 29.8 inches of rain over a 5-day period, 2,000 square miles. For 2,000 square miles in 5 days, Harvey produced almost 44 inches of rain. It exceeded the previous worst event in American history by 14 inches. You couldn't dream this up. If somebody would have asked me, what is your worst event? I would have never have thunk 14 inches above the previous event. It's just absolutely unbelievable. So for Harris County, we had about 1 trillion gallons of waterfall in a 4-day period. On average, most of us had just short of 34 inches of rain. That's 68% of our entire yearly rainfall in 4 days. And it's 70% of what we physically thought could fall from the sky in 4 days here. Probable maximum precipitation, we thought for Harris County was about 48 inches. The maximum total of 47.4 on Clear Creek at I-45, so this is down by NASA, was 95% of what we physically thought could fall out of the sky. And yes, if you jump over Clear Creek and you go into Galveston County, you get those 56-inch totals. It exceeded what we thought could fall out of the sky. So clearly, it's higher than what we thought. Over in Beaumont, Port Arthur, the 16.5 inches of rain was a foot above what we thought could even fall in a 5-day period. So that begs the question, what is the maximum amount of rain that can fall out of the sky around here in 4 or 5 days? And we think now it's probably upwards of somewhere of 65 to 70 inches. Which is almost double what most of us had. Keep that in mind. So that's the water that fell, the creeks and the bayous. We have 22 major creeks and bayous here, and all of them rose to very high levels. Everything you see in red, the water surface elevation rose to between the 100 and the 500-year elevation. So that is where your floodplains start to come into play. So the 100-year floodplain, everything in red, that 100-year floodplain was completely inundated with water from that creek or bayou. Everything you see in purple rose to above the 500-year level, the 500-year floodplain. And in several cases, we're talking feet over the 500-year. FEMA stops at the 500-year level. So in some cases, we do not really know what the historic context of some of these water levels were. They're way out there, well over 1,000 year type of an event. These are locations that had record flooding in the orange. So this is where water, during Harvey, this is the highest the water has ever been, at least in modern times, where we have reliable data. But the point I like to make with this map is look at the areas that were not records. There's quite a few areas here that were not records. Harvey was not a record flood for White Oak Bayou, for portions of Greens Bayou, for Spring Creek, for Upper Cypress and Little Cypress Creeks, portions of Sims Bayou. That means the water has been higher some other time. And the number one thing I've heard since Harvey is I didn't flood and I'm never going to flood. And this map says you can flood and the water has been higher before. And so that's an important takeaway. As bad as Harvey was in a lot of places, there are places that did not see record flooding. That does not mean you can't flood. It just means in this particular instance of Harvey, you had just enough breaks in the rainfall to allow those drainage systems to keep up with it. So you were very fortunate in those particular areas. Here's some images. This is Cypress Creek up on the north side of the county, exceeding the Tropical Storm Allison record there. I questioned this record a little bit. Nobody can really tell me where it came from, so I don't know if that's really a true record there. I haven't found anything else about an October 1949 storm in Harris County, so I kind of wonder about that one a little bit. We had one very serious situation. This was on Sunday evening with the Inverness Forest Levee. This is a levee that was built in the late 1980s to protect the subdivisions, about 130 homes. This is Hardy Toll Road. 1960 would be down here. This is Hardy Toll Road going up to the Woodlands. This is a subdivision built in the early 2000s to roughly present-day building standards. So we built before January 1 of 2018 in this county, 18 inches above the base flood elevation, so 18 inches above the 100-year storm. No one did anything wrong here. The storm just simply exceeded that criteria and design. After January 1 of this year in unincorporated Harris County, we now build 2 feet above the 500-year floodplain. And that ordinance will go into effect in the city of Houston September 1st. It's some of the strictest building codes in the nation. Would that have saved these homes if they would have been 2 feet above the 500-year? In this case, some of them would have still flooded because the creek was above the 500-year level. We were very concerned on Sunday evening of the potential overtopping of this levee. So this is water going over the top of it. You can see how close the water was to going over the top. We're talking inches. And we issued the voluntary evacuation for that. More importantly is what happened during the night into Monday morning. Water in Cypress Creek here became so high it started coming through the pump station and cascading down onto the base of the levee. It was like a waterfall on the inside of the levee. And so it began eroding the levee under that pump station. And a Harris County Constable's officer that was deployed into this subdivision with the voluntary evacuation order was walking this levee every hour. And he found this and called it in. And at this point, we were now concerned not only of the overtopping, but this levee was going to breach or fail in somewhat of a situation like you saw in New Orleans when the levees gave way there. And so this is when we upgraded this to a mandatory evacuation. We wanted everybody out. We worked some of ideas on that Monday of what we could do here to try to prevent this levee from failing. We could not get heavy equipment up here. It was too soft. I mean, we would do more damage than good. We actually had an idea of using helicopters to drop sandbags into this to help plug it like they did in New Orleans. But we felt that the impact of that would actually damage the levee more. So we went with the course of action of evacuating the residents behind it and leaving it alone. And in the end, the levee held, and we were able to repair it about 5 days later. The West Fork of the San Jacinto River, unbelievable flooding. I honestly never thought I would see a flood on the West Fork or anywhere in the San Jacinto that would eclipse October 1994. But Harvey did. This is US 59 coming up out of the Humble area towards Porter. Those squiggly lines there are the concrete barriers that used to be in the middle of the freeway. The river just pushed across the freeway. Tremendous flooding, deep flooding on the San Jacinto Basin. Very high velocity flows. And in some cases, entire homes were torn away and carried down the river. Clear Creek at I-45, this is where the 47.4 inches of rain happened. This is the creek about right here. The creek expanded to about 2 miles wide. 30,000 homes flooded along Clear Creek in Harris, Galveston, and Brazoria counties. And then Buffalo Bayou, there was really 2 floods on Buffalo Bayou. One was the sheer intensity of rainfall on Saturday night and Sunday morning. Buffalo Bayou east of Beltway 8 and Gessner rose to about a 500-year level through downtown Houston. And then as releases were made from Addicts and Barker, the upstream portion of Buffalo Bayou, so west of Beltway 8, west of Gessner, would rise to very high levels on Sunday night into Monday and remain at those levels for the next couple of weeks as those releases. Previous record was April of 2009. And Harvey exceeded that by about 6 to 7 feet. So this was truly a devastating flood for Buffalo. Buffalo bore the brunt of those extended releases. All the water from Addicts and Barker has to go into Buffalo Bayou. So you're putting a lot of water down Buffalo Bayou for a long period of time. And just like a big river system like the Mississippi or the Ohio that can flood for weeks and months, when you take that water away, the banks start to collapse. They become used to having the pressure of that water holding them in place. And when you take it away, they slough off. And that is what we've been seeing on Buffalo Bayou for the last year. And this will continue. This is a natural process that will continue for the next year or so as that bank tries to reestablish itself in some type of a function that it can hold itself in place. The other thing we saw with Buffalo was the complete removal of nearly all the vegetation along the channel. Before Harvey, Buffalo had tremendous amounts of vegetation along its sides. And Harvey, just because so much water was moved down it, it eroded all the vegetation. In some cases, it took all the tree roots and everything. And so that significantly damaged the side slopes of the channel. So there's been a lot of trying to keep that stuff in place and trying to keep homes from collapsing into the channel. Addicts Reservoir, this is the northern one. Tax day was a wake-up call, I think, to some people. But for a lot of people, it still didn't click about the potential of these reservoirs. Tax day got to 10265. The edge of government-owned land, the 100-year pool, where no homes can be built inside of that, is about 102.9. So it was right there at tax day. This time for Harvey, it went to 109.1, 6 feet higher. Pretty much encompassing all of the flood pool outside of the 100-year floodplain. Thousands and thousands of homes would flood in that flood pool, both behind Addicts and Barker. The other situation we've never dealt with before in 70 years is the engagement of one of the spillways on these reservoirs. They have spillways at both of their ends, so there's a total of 4. These reservoirs, the dams tie back into natural ground. And because we're so flat here, when you build a reservoir, you would like to tie it into some type of elevation rise, so the side of a hill or the side of a mountain. But in this case, we don't have that, so these reservoir dams tie back into natural ground. Water will never go over the front of these dams. So if you look at them at this area down here around the Beltway and I-10, water will never go over the top of that. They're not designed that way. They're designed for water to spill around their ends to protect the faces of these dams. You never want water going over the top of anything earthen because it can erode it. So this was the forecast on Sunday evening. Addicts was forecast to go to 112.4. And we were working very hard. We had an entire group of people that were doing nothing, but every time we would get different forecasts trying to model what did that mean and how was that going to impact areas. And so this was a 2-dimensional model we ran, this showing the water coming out of Addicts and then running down. This is the West Belt. This is the face of the dam. Spring Branch is over in this area. And as you can see, at 112.4, everything would have been inundated between the Beltway and the face of the dam, all the way down to Buffalo Bayou. All this water goes down to Buffalo Bayou. There would still have not been enough capacity through here. The water would have used the Beltway underpasses to cut east, flowing through the underpasses and flooding portions of Spring Branch over through here. And that's what we were concerned about on Sunday evening when it was forecast to go to 112.4. Just to give you some idea, these reservoir pools are about 20 square miles apiece. And on Sunday evening, about 9 to 10 o'clock, they were rising at a half a foot an hour. The pool, 20 square miles, rising at half a foot an hour. It's how much inflow was pouring into these reservoirs. Just to kind of give you an idea of, this is what I'm talking about with the spillway. This is that north end spillway right here at this red dot. So this is the end of the spillway, this concrete armored section, and simply the water just flows out and around it. Now, if we would have hit 112.4, water would have been pouring over the top of that concrete and spilling out. The other concern on Sunday evening was not just engagement of this north end spillway, but engagement of all 4 of the spillways, that the pools would rise and spill around all 4 ends. So there would have been a lot more water pouring out of those reservoirs. This is Barker, the southern reservoir. Again, about 6 feet higher than tax day. It's interesting that both of them, their Harvey records were 6 feet over the tax day, and that's because the rainfall was almost uniform across both of the watersheds, between 28 and 33 inches of rain across both Addicts and Barker. So you had almost equal pool levels with respect to their records. This is floodgate releases into Upper Buffalo. This would be Highway 6 right here, and this is looking east into Buffalo Bayou. The majority of the flooding in Barker was in the Fort Bend County portion of Barker, down in the Cinco Ranch, Grand Lakes area. about 3,000 homes flooded, about 3,400 homes flooded. In all of Fort Bend County for Harvey, about 7,000 homes flooded. So the flooding in Fort Bend County was from the Brazos River, or really from behind the reservoir in Barker. And there was also a couple of subdivisions that when the river gets high, they can't gravity drain their water, so you can't push the water out into the river. They have gates that shut against the water that's coming in, and you have to then pump that water over the top of that levee, very much like you do in New Orleans. And those pumps could not keep up with how fast the rain was falling, and homes flooded from that and a couple of inside the levees in Fort Bend County. So the damage, this is just in Harris County alone, 300,000 vehicles. The total damages for Harvey, this includes everything, not just Harris County, $25 billion. This will come in second to Hurricane Katrina's $60 billion. So Harvey will likely be the second largest or costliest hurricane disaster in American history. I said earlier, this number is outdated now. 100,000 persons rescued by government resources and anywhere between 30 and 50,000 more rescued by civilian resources. We'll never know the number. It's not like people are out there writing it down. It was getting people out. And that's just really in Harris County. If you start looking at Galveston, Fort Bend, and Waller, and Montgomery, you're probably doubling that number in some cases. So a massive, massive rescue operation. The structure flooding, this is homes only. This does not include apartment complexes or multifamily facilities or businesses. 154,170 homes flooded in Harris County. 21,000 flooded in Galveston County, 78,000 in Fort Bend, and another 4,200 in Montgomery. Total statewide, about 500,000 structures were damaged or destroyed by Harvey. And that goes from Rockport, Corpus Christi, all the way over to the state line at the Louisiana state line. The worst previous event in this county was Allison, 73,000 homes. We doubled what we experienced in Tropical Storm Allison. The 154-170 is 11% of the total structures in this county. So even as bad as that is, a lot of structures did not flood. 105,340, 68% were outside the 100-year floodplain. They were not required to have flood insurance. And I'll point out a couple things on the map. You see these very intense areas, high concentrations of red. That's pretty much showing every structure flooded, and it mimics very closely to our creeks and bayous. So this is Meyerland and the Bel Air area. This is Buffalo. This is in the Reservoir Pools, Cypress Creek, the West Fork, Greens Bayou, and Halls Bayou. Absolutely, you don't hear a lot about this area, the East Aldine area. In Aldine area, there was absolute horrible devastation in that area. You don't hear a lot about it. You hear a lot about Meyerland, you hear a lot about Kingwood and other places. And then even down here in Pasadena and the city of South Houston. But notice the speckledness away from the creek and the bayou. So all through here, in this area, out here to the north and the west a little bit, and especially down here, that is showing the flooding from the rainfall rates exceeding the street drainage systems. So in this particular case, your house could be built 2 or 3 inches higher than your neighbor's house, and that's all it took. Your neighbor's house flooded and you didn't. So unlike along the creeks and the bayous where every single house flooded, and in a lot of cases 2 or 3 feet of water, devastating flooding, this is very shallow flooding that just ekes into the house and then comes back out. And I've heard stories of people telling me, I just had enough water in the house to come in right around the baseboards. It didn't even wet the carpet in the center of the room. And that's that type of flooding from the street drainage systems, because as soon as the rain stops, those streets start to go down. And it can be just a slight bit of difference between your house and your neighbor's house. So you could go down a street and you'd have 20 homes, and 6 or 8 would have flood damage, and the rest wouldn't. And that's where you hear these stories of it stopped right at the door. It stopped right at that seal of the door. Of 154, 170, 36% had flood insurance. The average payout for a person who had flood insurance for Harvey was $120,000. It's the average payout from flood insurance claim. The average payout for someone who did not have flood insurance, that got individual assistance from FEMA, was $4,000 to $7,000. That is the most important statistic to take away from this, from Harvey, on the need for flood insurance. It's so important here. And what I will say, everybody focuses so much on the floodplains. The floodplains determine how much you are going to pay for flood insurance. If you're inside a floodplain, you're going to pay more because your risk is higher. But just because you're outside of a floodplain does not mean you do not have a flood risk. And that is something we really have to get serious about here. Every single one of us has a flood risk. I have a flood risk. You all have a flood risk. If we live here, you can flood. And I promise you, if you had 60 inches of rain fall on your neighborhood in 4 days, you're going to flood, even if you didn't flood during Harvey. And with that, I'm probably over time. Sorry. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you very much, Jeff. We're going to open it to Q&A now, but first, Josh has a quick announcement.
I guess I have an announcement. We're going to do Q&A. We only have time for about maybe 1 or 2 questions tops. And so we can maybe take one on this side and one on the other side, and that'll just be it. Make sure that your question is a question and not a comment, please, because we are pressed for time. So with that in mind...
I need to raise that. Sorry. We're so close to a speaker.
Yeah. Okay. So we're going to let Laura pass that off first, and we'll get your questions answered.
Okay, all right, I'm gonna hand it over to Susan. Thank you. How many of the releases were there actually? And what do you think would have happened if there hadn't been the releases?
So I assume that's Addicts and Barker, the releases from Addicts and Barker, because there was also releases from Lake Conroe and other lakes, but we'll talk about Addicts and Barker. Addicts and Barker releases started on Monday morning. The initial plan, if you will, was releases would start about 2 a.m. in the morning, but that had to be moved up because of that rate of rise I told you, that half a foot per hour was happening. So the Corps of Engineers was quite worried about that. And then once the releases began, they pretty much continued nonstop for about 14 to 18 days at that level. And so these were maximum releases from these reservoirs. It was 8,000 CFS, and a CFS is about the size of a basketball. It was 8,000 from Addicts and 8,000 from Barker, so combined 16,000, and they continued at that rate for, it was over 2 weeks. But there was not a lot of the gates going up and down, no. In a reservoir situation, you try not to do that, because if your gates are going up and down, the water downstream is doing this, and that means you're getting into a situation with those banks and stuff that you can cause rapid changes, and that could cause things to collapse, and it puts a lot of pressure on bridges and stuff like that. So from a standpoint of reservoir operations, both from Lake Conroe and Addicts and Barker, you slowly increase the releases, and then you hold them, and then you slowly come back on them, because like people are asking, the rainfall is over, the water's going down, why are you pushing out so much water still from Addicts and Barker? Why is the Corps continuing to release so much water? One thing you have to remember, we were still in hurricane season. And typically we can get struck with tropical storms and hurricanes in the month of September. And so the Corps needed to get as much water out of those reservoirs as possible in case something else did happen.
One final question over here. For much of the news, the eye of Harvey was anticipated to retrace almost directly over the reservoirs. Had that model held true, any idea how much more damage Harris County would have suffered from overflow or otherwise?
I don't think the center necessarily would have made a big difference. As we saw when it was 140 miles down the coast, we had big problems here. And so one of the things to remember is anytime the center is to your southwest, you're on that dirty side. You're on that side that's going to be getting all the rain and the wind. And so had the center have crossed directly over the top of Harris County instead of moving back out into the Gulf of Mexico, I don't think it would have made all that much difference. The northwest part of the county may have gotten another foot of rain or so potentially. But, I mean, we're kind of second guessing at this point because the rain shield, as Harvey moved up the coast, the rain shield became more concentrated down toward the coast. And Harvey actually kind of took on a little bit of what we call a subtropical nature as it moved up the coast. So it wasn't truly tropical anymore. We were just focusing the heavy rains near the center. So it wasn't always necessarily important where that center was because the heavy rains would focus sometimes way east of that center. When we were dealing with everything here on Tuesday, that's when they were just absolutely slammed in the Beaumont-Port Arthur area with devastating flooding. And that actually took place on the west side of the center. So pretty much opposite of what happened here. And so Harvey was doing some weird morphing, if you will, as it moved up to our south and then east. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.